Hey, so welcome to Tech Ed, and it's the last session of the day, and I'm sure you guys are all burning out, but I appreciate you coming out to an IT Pro view of Windows Azure. My name's Joey Snow. I'm a senior technical evangelist. I work in the developer and platform evangelism team on campus in Redmond, but my job is not developer related. I'm one of you guys. I'm an IT Pro evangelist. I've been at Microsoft 3 years. Prior to joining Microsoft, I spent 13-ish years on the other side doing your jobs and screwing up everything several times until I learned better, and then screwing it up again. And so if you've messed it up in IT, I've probably dealt with it once or twice. So there's hope for us all. So what I want to do today is, how many of you currently have Windows Azure applications in your environments? That is awesome. Really, you can admit it. I need a cricket sound effect. How many of you have to start dealing with Windows Azure applications? Okay, here's another question. How many of you have Windows Azure applications in your environment and don't know it? Right? Because your developers build it. David raises his hand. That's awesome. Because your developers build it and you don't know it. So what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to kind of give you guys an overview of Windows Azure. Is anybody comfortable with what Windows Azure is? Like 2 hands, 3 hands raised up. Okay, I'm going to give you kind of more in-depth information on Windows Azure. And then we're going to talk about how that affects you, right, in your life. So this is interactive, right? I like a little interactivity because it's kind of boring for me to stand up here and pummel you with PowerPoint all day. How many of you guys in here think that your jobs are going away because of this stuff? Be honest, seriously. How many of you think that that's... Because I saw it all over Twitter this morning. Right, because were we all in the keynote? Saw the keynote. I did a cool little demo of some cool stuff in the keynote. And, you know, after the keynote, we were watching Twitter, and a lot of people were like, cloud. My job goes away. I'm an IT guy. I don't care about cloud. Who cares about cloud? Okay, the bulk of the room cares about cloud because there's a lot of reasons to move to cloud computing, right? Or I should say extend out or leverage cloud computing. Because the reality is, we understand, you guys aren't going to just roll in with a forklift, pick up your entire infrastructure, and dump it out there in somebody else's data center. There's a lot of reasons not to do that, right? You may have compliance reasons, right? You may have data security issues. You just may not be ready. But there's a lot of other times in which you want to start leveraging the power of cloud computing. Maybe start dabbling and dipping your toes in. Maybe getting some of these applications out there that you need to scale up or scale down rather rapidly out into the cloud environment and start leveraging it. So I don't really expect anybody to go in with a forklift and move everything. I expect everybody to start leveraging. So what I'm going to give you guys today is just kind of an understanding so that you guys are comfortable with it. And then we're going to go through some of the key tasks that we as IT professionals perform with Windows Azure. And my goal of this is to really show you, your life doesn't change all that much, right? What you do is kind of the same, it's just where you're doing it that really changes. So, we're going to talk about fundamental aspects of Windows Azure, show you how you deploy and manage applications and monitor applications out in the Windows Azure platform. Brief, kind of quick talk about cloud computing. Who's seen that slide today? This is, okay, nobody. So the cloud kind of consists of 3 kind of basic services, right? You've got infrastructure as a service. A lot of this could be related to private cloud, could be hosters, right? This is where you're going out and either dedicating or sharing resources. From an infrastructure standpoint, in other words, I've got a better slide that kind of describes all this stuff, so I'll just breeze past this. You've got software as a service, right? Which is you kind of get the whole thing, right? Probably most of us in this room are using some form of software as a service, right? Hotmail, that's software as a service, right? You start going out into the newer things like Office 365, software as a service, okay? So it's like you're basically paying, it's a subscription type of thing. You're getting the whole enchilada. And then when we talk about platform as a service, that's where Windows Azure is. And so what are kind of our responsibilities or our duties? Well, today, in your on-premises infrastructure, you're responsible for everything. You've got to manage the networking, you've got to manage the storage, servers, hypervisors, all of that stuff. You're on the hook for all this stuff, right? You're running around in cold server rooms wearing parkas and swapping hard drives out, right? Well, with infrastructure as a service, kind of start changing that, where we start removing a lot of the things like networking and storage and the servers themselves, and maybe to a certain extent even the hypervisor, right? So you're going out and saying, hey, look, for a subscription service, I want to put a virtual machine or some other type of services running on somebody else's premises, on somebody else's infrastructure. And it could be shared, it could be dedicated, right? Or you could even build kind of an infrastructure as a service on your own when we start talking about private clouds, right? Then there's platform as a service, where we kind of take care of everything, and you give us the applications and you give us data if you want to. I'll kind of talk a little bit more about that if you want to piece here in just a moment. So you start to see your kind of levels of responsibility, or the stuff that you have to go and constantly be mindful of, kind of changing. Now when you see it this way, does it get a little scary? Who likes chasing around server hardware all day, every day? I used to manage a pretty big infrastructure, and I chased servers all day, and it just wore me out, right? When I go home, I don't want to even see a blinking red light, right? What the goal of this is, and when we start talking about cloud computing, really where we want you to start thinking about things, is like, how can you be more responsive to the needs of your business, the needs of your companies? And running around chasing server hardware that's falling over every other day is not a way to do it, because they don't back up the armored trucks anymore to the IT department, open the doors and go, spend all you want. What do they ask for IT departments? Cut. And what else do they want? More. Right? So we're going to make you run twice as much workload on servers that are 7 years old. And no, we don't have any plan to replace them. And that kind of puts us in a bind from an IT perspective. We really can't be responsive to what their needs are. So the shift when we start looking at moving from our on-premises resources and start leveraging out into cloud resources, kind of a shift in your spending. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that when you move to the cloud, everything is cheaper and there's magic and unicorns and butterflies, right? But it's a shift in thinking of the way you spend money. You move from capital expenditures, to which it's very difficult to get in a lot of IT worlds. I remember the last time I tried to do server replacements a couple of years ago. It was a nightmare trying to get that budget aligned and allocated, and you've got to plan for it out 5-6 years, right? But nobody knows that you've planned out to replace all the servers in 4 or 5 years, and then the HR department comes in with this big, massive application that they want to run, and you've got to get it installed tomorrow. Oh, and by the way, we don't have any budget to buy any servers, okay? You change from that capital expenditure into an operational expenditure. And it's interesting. Operational expenditures, people are a little more willing to part with a little bit of money, especially if you can gain benefits from this. It also allows you to be more rapid and to be able to go and say, okay, HR department, let's take a look and see what kind of technologies your new whiz-bang application is utilizing, and let's see how we can actually get that out and get it deployed. So we kind of understand the differences between platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, right? Software as a service, we kind of do it all for you. So with platform as a service, and specifically Windows Azure, we're going to give you all of that infrastructure. It's going to run in our data centers, and then what you have to provide us is an application. What does that application look like? Well, here is a kind of Joey's horrible PowerPoint skills version of an application, or what a cloud service looks like. You see there on your left side, we've got a great little load balancer there. So it looks like we've got multiple roles. And what roles are, there's a couple of different roles. Have a web role. It's an IIS 7.5 box, essentially, right, where you're running ASP.NET services. You can have a worker role, where you're going to run some sort of managed code, some .NET, right? We introduced this new thing called a VM role. I'll get to that in a moment, right? And they're all kind of tied together. And each time you run one of these roles in an application, you can actually have multiple instances of a role that build up an application. So when I showed the application today, earlier in the keynote, up in Windows Azure, it was a payroll application. And I had a web tier, and I had some database, or some worker roles going on in there as well. And I just wanted to expand out and add additional instances to my web server tier, because that's what was going to get hit as everybody starts building their reporting. So I just add instances of that very same role. Pretty clear? Understand? And then if down here at the bottom we have this finicky little thing called storage, right? We have to put our stuff somewhere. And there's multiple types of storage. In Windows Azure, You've got table storage, you've got blob storage, you've got queues. And then from a database perspective, we have SQL Azure, which is well outside of the scope of this conversation. So this application, it looks like, I'll use an example. This is kind of built off of a couple of different scenarios. So those of you who may not know, we run a couple of different video properties at Microsoft. One is Channel 9, and that's the developer side. And the other side is for IT Pro TechNet Edge. And we come to these events, and you can see us out over in the community lounge. You see we've got big cameras and lights, and we go in and interview people. And this particular application is kind of designed around a scenario where normally we publish a video or two a day. So we go into our main website, and we upload a video, and then that gets processed and dropped off. But when we come to events like this, we have to be able to scale it out. Because we're shooting multiple videos. We've shot, I think, 6 today. And that's only because we had a very shortened window to shoot it. And tomorrow we're going to probably shoot double that. And we have to take all of these and we have to process them. And what our processing does is it does a number of different things. I don't want to bore you with the details. But we have to go through multiple encodings to spit out MP3 files, to spit out high-quality WMV files, low-quality WMV files, and to do all this stuff. So what we have is we've got, in this particular application, we have a web server. It's running on port 8080. That's kind of like an admin website where we can go in and look and see what our jobs are doing. In WebWorld 1, that's our portal where we're actually taking and uploading all of our video content to. And then it goes through this worker role and it does some things, and then it heads down into a VM role where all the encoding is handled. And I'll talk about in a minute why we chose to use VM role in that particular scenario, but just as an example, that's what happens. So when I go to access this particular application, I simply go to joeysencodingservice.cloudapp.net, and that load balancer goes and finds where that application is pointed at and points me to the proper instance, and we start working. So this is what an application looks like from a Windows Azure perspective. We've got roles, we've got instances, and we've got storage, and then, of course, there's that database thing over there. All right? So let's talk a little bit more about the different role types, because outside of web and worker roles, there's a couple ways to tweak them. So a normal web role is hosted on IIS 7.5, and this is awesome because if you manage IIS 7.5 through the IIS Service Manager, or if you use PowerShell, and if you're doing things like doing virtual directories or creating multiple websites within that, you can do that now today in Windows Azure. It's a little bit different than when Windows Azure first came out because we ran this thing called Hosted Web Core, which didn't have a lot of that capabilities. So whatever you're running in IIS 7.5 today in terms of management, in terms of running things and a lot of those features, for the most part, you can actually run that. It's exactly the same. The worker role, it's an executable, it's some sort of managed code, right? Some kind of code that you've got running up there. And then the VM role, the role is actually a virtual machine. Now I want to kind of clarify some things with VM role. VM role is not where you go and put your entire infrastructure, your Active Directory, your SharePoint sites, and everything else up there running. And I'll tell you why. Windows Azure doesn't maintain your state. And by that, what I mean is, I can fire up something and get some code running and get an application running up in a virtual machine, right? But if that ever goes down for any reason, or we're moving it, or we're upgrading something, anything that you've got running stateful within that virtual machine that you haven't pulled out into some sort of storage is gone when that machine resets. Okay, we don't keep it, we don't snapshot, we don't do those things. All right? So the point of the VM role is this. You've got your normal web and worker role, which runs under the context of a normal everyday user, meaning concept of least privilege, right? We don't want anybody to run anything there. It's just like standard web server, and it just goes and dishes out pages. We have this new thing that we introduced at the PDC, which is called the admin web and worker role. Admin web and worker role gives us a little more ability, a little more power to do things like warm-up scripts, right? So we can go into an admin mode, we can run scripts, we can add registry changes, we can do some types of unattended setup. And then in VM role is kind of, I like to position it like this. In your admin web and worker role, if you're running a script or warming something up or getting something installed, and it takes more than 2 or 3 minutes, you might want to consider going over to the VM role, Because with VM role, I configure a virtual machine with everything in it running as I needed and all configured so that when it starts up, everything is there running versus having to start the service and then wait for all of your scripts and all the registry changes to happen. Now, if we go back to the example that I was talking about earlier about our video encoding, there's special software, some special sauce that my team has actually, the development team who built this application has put in, and they don't have a silent uninstall, and it requires like 3 other things to be installed beforehand, right? So there's this kind of tiered thing that we have to get this application running. And it takes about 10, 20, 30 minutes to get this entire piece done if we do it unattended, and sometimes it falls over, as sometimes unattended installations can do, right? Yes, right? No matter how good your scripts are, sometimes things just throw bits and fall over. So we built this in a VM role. The reason being that I've got all of this stuff, it's already configured exactly as I want it, and I can run that application up there. This is not something like Amazon service. We're not running your entire infrastructure in VMs that are connected to each other, that if they fall over, we still can retrieve the data or we can snapshot. It's not infrastructure as a service. This is platform as a service. It's designed to run applications. Okay? Pretty good idea on those roles and the differences between the role types. The idea being here, if you can do it in a normal web and worker role, that's awesome because you're abstracting out any complexity. You hand us the application, we run it. Sometimes services stop. Fabric Controller tries to restart services. If it can't do that, it's going to restart the Windows Azure virtual machine, right? And if it can't do that, we're going to move you over to another place. Sometimes we do upgrades. Sometimes we need there's failures, right? Drives fail, those things, we've got to move you over. It's clustered. If you've got multiple instances, we've got to move you around. And the best case is that if you can run it in that normal version, that's the way you want to do it. If you need to run a few warm-up scripts and get a few minutes of configuration, drop a registry file in, whatever you need to do, warm up a web server, that's great. Go ahead and run that in the admin mode. And then finally, with the most complex or the most control that you need, right? So I don't care about control when I'm talking about a web and worker role. I'm just like, hey, I know my app runs in it, and I just throw it out there. But if I need to really control how that application is set up when it runs, you can run it in VM role. Now, there's a couple of sessions around VM role that I encourage you to go and attend because they're going to get a lot more in-depth about it. This is kind of this high-level view of it. So I encourage you to kind of get the information, go a little bit deeper on VM role if it's something that you're really looking at and considering. The session is tomorrow, and I think I have the code at the end of my deck, so we'll get to it. So the VM role has with the control comes a tax. And that tax is management. Because the whole idea of putting an application out into Windows Azure is the fact that I'm not constantly having to chase the thing around, right? If it's Patch Tuesday, I don't have to worry about patching it. We're handling all of that. And we're moving things around as necessary to patch the underlying systems. But if you're running a VM role, you're still responsible for that virtual machine and the OS that's in it. So, this is kind of the life cycle of a virtual machine in Windows Azure VM role. First, you build your image. Windows Server 2008 R2, SP1. Okay? That's how you build it. You create whatever services you need, you get everything installed, you get everything configured, make all of those crazy installations that you need to do, whatever you need to do. Test it locally. You're going to add some integration components. Right, just like we have in running today's Hyper-V environments, there's specific Azure, Windows Azure integration components and things that allow the Windows Azure service to have a look inside and monitor how things are running in it. Then you upload that VM. And dependent upon the size of your virtual machine, that can take some time. And once you get it uploaded into Windows Azure, we'll deploy the service, and I'll get into deployment in just a moment. But here's where the tax really kind of starts to kind of hit us. We have to maintain it and upgrade that virtual machine. Now, we do use the concept of differencing disks when we talk about the VM role. where you can have a parent and a child. Anybody not familiar with the concept of a differencing disk in a virtual machine world, right? You've got a parent and a child. You build the base image, and then you ever have a differencing, and then you can patch that differencing disk so it takes a lot shorter to upload it. But it's only chained out to one in Windows Azure. So eventually, you're going to end up having to go back and recreate that main base image, or get that main base image to that perfect state that you want it. And then we're doing this process over and over again. So we do a lot of patching, we do a lot of management, we do a lot of maintenance. You're on the hook for that operating system versus in the other one. And then this cycle just kind of continues and continues on. So I mentioned today that, and earlier I kind of really tried to land the point that we understand that you guys aren't going to just take everything and throw it all up there. There are going to be a lot of times that you simply want to leverage cloud services. And maybe you want to, for some reason, keep database information located on your own premises, but you still want to leverage compute power up in Windows Azure, or run your application up into Windows Azure. And a lot of times people want some secure network connectivity between what you have running in the cloud and your on-premise infrastructure. So we've introduced Windows Azure Connect, right? We talked about this a little bit in the keynote today, right, which is currently in beta, and allows this hybrid scenario where you have applications running on your own, some aspect of an application running on premise and some aspect running up in the cloud, and we can securely connect the two, right? So it also allows some pretty cool remote administration on side of Windows Azure, and it supports web, worker, and VM roles. And it's really, 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 really simple to configure and set up. Because today it's currently agent-based. Now I know we kind of go, agent-based, really? Isn't it 2011? Right? Today, the current plan, the current implementation is an agent, and the agent needs to run on whatever machine you're connecting back into in your infrastructure. So you see I've got a pretty little diagram over there where it looks like I've got my application running there, and I've created, because of this Windows Azure Connect, secure connectivity to whatever machines have this agent running. And it looks like I've got the agent running on a couple of dev machines, and I've got it running on a couple of databases. But all of that IPsec setup is done for you. When you set up Windows Azure Connect, you click a button in the portal, and it says, would you like to install the agent? You say yes. And it sets it up and configures it. And then whenever you're in some crazy hotel room, say in like Atlanta, and you connect to the internet, hey, look, I can connect to my application through Windows Azure Connect.
Does it also require IPv6?
So the IPv6 stuff is there, and that's what the agent is reliant upon in configuring and setting it up. So we do have, I think in the next slide I actually have what the agent runs on, but if I don't have it in the slide, when you go to set up the operating system, so Server 2008, there are certain operating systems that it has to run on in Windows Azure Connect. So are we totally scared about Windows Azure anymore? I hope not. So what about you? What is your job here? Right? What's the experience? Well, how do we do things today? How do we manage today? We use tools like PowerShell. We use remote desktop, right? We use our Windows Server administration tools, right? Event logs, performance monitoring. We use tools like System Center. Well, with the Windows Azure platform, today, all of those things are in your toolkit that you can use to manage and deal with Windows Azure, right? So whether it be System Center or Remote Desktop, IIS, if you just love IIS Manager, you can go ahead and use it on your application that's running up in Windows Azure. Your management tools, PowerShell is especially great. There's also third-party monitoring tools. And there's that little piece of software I demonstrated today in the keynote known as Concero, which is another way that we as IT professionals can kind of get a look-see into Windows Azure and do things like deployment and look at our applications and how they're all configured. We can scale up instances, as I demonstrated today. Pause, stop, restart. We can actually, through the Concero tool, actually create and initiate a remote desktop connection. So it's familiar tools, and the other thing is it's familiar tasks. Has anybody seen this diagram, this operations framework? Raise your hands, yes? You guys are like, seriously, can we get done? There's beer, right? Yeah, I see, I got you on that one. Right? ITIL, process. Does anybody have process management in that like you are responsible for doing things like deploying applications to make sure that they run securely in your environment? And that there is a change control system? Anybody heard of that change control thing? Right? Anybody been completely handcuffed by your change control processes? Right? So you're doing things like you're creating and managing accounts. You're doing things like deploying applications and upgrading applications. You're troubleshooting them when they fall over. Right? You're planning for disaster recovery. You're planning for security. So when somebody comes out to you and they say, look, Windows Azure is so simple and it's so easy that the developers can just put applications out there and we no longer need IT pros, you can just kind of laugh and say, yeah, that's going to fly in my company. Because that's just not the reality. You don't just let the development team go out and randomly put applications out there and say, all right, now we're in production, we're good to go, without some sort of review, without some sort of process management. So all of these things that you're doing today are the things that you're going to have to deal with Windows Azure. Just think about Windows Azure or cloud computing in general, no matter where you're running it, as it's just another place where my stuff runs. It's just another server, so to speak. It's just that I'm not responsible for chasing around the hard drive when it falls over. So your task, the things that you are responsible for, enforcing that policy, enforcing that change management, working with the development teams to design things that are secure and that make sense for your organization, are all still the same tasks that you're going to do. We're going to free you up from being hung up underneath that hardware. So the second area, now we've talked about what Windows Azure is. We've talked a little bit about what your role is in Windows Azure. Now let's kind of dive a little bit deeper. And let's look at deploying applications, because it's the one thing that I know most IT professionals are doing on a pretty regular basis. Having to deploy applications. So a little bit more on Windows Azure. There's two independent environments that run in Windows Azure. One is in production and one is in staging. A lot of customers that I've talked to and a lot of scenarios that I've seen, there's actually even multiple accounts where your development team, they may be developing locally because Visual Studio provides a local development environment, and then you move it out to a QA environment, right? I'll hark back to my demo earlier today in the keynote where I showed that I had a test and a production environment, two separate Windows Azure accounts, if you notice that. So I move everything there, and then when we're ready to go to production, I've got even another account. But within each one of these accounts, there's that production and staging environment. And what's really great is you can deploy into staging, do some even more testing, and then move it over to production. Where these two environments really come into play and we can really start doing some cool stuff is when we're ready to move things in. I'll show that here in just a moment when we're upgrading applications. All right, now we need to talk about where your data is, right? These things called geolocation and affinity groups. When I go in and I set up a Windows Azure application, and it may be just easy enough for me to just show this to you, so. This is the Windows Azure Management Portal. Okay, Silverlight-based application. I connect to windows.azure.com. I log in with my subscription information, and this is what I'm presented. And so you'll see here I have, I'm trying to use the wrong computer. You'll see here I have a number of different applications that I've got deployed out here. And within these applications, it looks like I'm using, both applications I have deployed, I'm only using one role, and they're simple web roles, right? But when I go out and I'm ready to deploy a new application or a new hosted service, I have to provide regions or affinity groups. So I can choose where I want to deploy my application to. Now, this becomes very important when you start playing in the lands of other countries that have rules that state that you can't run something over there. Our data must remain within these borders. It also comes into play when we start dealing with application performance and where we want our users, because you want your users closest to the data, right? So you can choose whatever region that you want your application deployed to, or you can choose or create an affinity group, which allows me to actually create particular locations to put my application data in, so I can say, hey, I want this to run here and this to run here, and I can create a group an affinity group. So if I go back to the slides, you'll see when I talk about affinity groups, you've got affinitized, so we're grouping our services with their resources. We're making sure our storage is located in the same place as our applications. Probably a smart idea, right? So that we've got geolocation in a single location. We can also specify subregions. You can go specifically geolocated, where that's that first option. I say I want to just go in north central US. Just throwing that one out there. Or you can do the unspecified, which is, I don't know, Windows Azure, pick one. Which is probably not the most recommended method of doing it. And of course, being the typical demo guy that I am, it's actually how I configured most of my accounts. So I don't recommend it. Don't do what I do on my demos. Now I want to introduce to you the concept of fault and upgrade domains. Fault domains, so when we look at deploying applications out into Windows Azure, and when we deploy multiple instances of a particular role, we want to make sure that that role, so let's talk about that first web role that we've got located in this scenario. We want to make sure that if I'm running two different instances, that they're not running on the same rack of servers. Why would we do that? Anyone? Yeah, because, you know, it may not be running on the same server, but if it's running in the same rack, and you've got Johnny, the junior admin, who decides that he wants to start playing basketball in the switch room, and he rips out every cord there, that whole rack goes down, you're still not losing everything, right? So the concept of a fault domain is within basically a single rack, within a single load balancer. Right? So you can create, we got multiple fault domains where your application is put when you have multiple instances. So if I've got two instances of role, we make sure that one is in one fault domain, one is in another fault domain to prevent them from going down. We can also deal with upgrade domains. And you're going to see this when I talk about upgrading applications, which kind of allows us to do rolling upgrades of particular roles. So it says, okay, VM1 in this particular role, if I've got multiple instances, is going to run here, and that's one. And if I upgrade it still makes sure there's a second one that's actually running so that I can roll through and not have that application down. Make sense? And you can have multiple upgrade and fault domains. So what does a deployment look like? Well, what does it look like today? Your developer builds an application and it hands off to you and it says, okay, IT, I want you to deploy this application. It's the same thing that happens today. A Windows Azure application consists of two things: a package file and a definition file. So there's a configuration file that allows me, it's an XML, it tells me how many instances are running, we can set up certain things, and the rest is where that application is. In the VM role, there's another thing called the virtual machine that you actually have to upgrade, that you actually have to run. So what is your role in application deployment? Well, first you're going to create that hosted service account and any storage account necessary, right? You may actually need to create a SQL Azure database, or maybe you have a DBA in your environment. You're going to upload service certificates, and I'll talk about service certificates when I talk about various methods of management. But what it enables us to do is use remote tools like PowerShell and System Center. So we upload a certificate up there that allows me to access these applications, right? You configure any deployment plugins that you have. So if you want to choose, if you want to have remote desktop access, you want to do some diagnostics, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, and any upgrade domain configurations that you need to have. And then you deploy the service. So if I go back to my demo world here, when I create a new service account, there's actually a couple of ways to do it. The first way, and the most common way, is through our portal, right? So you've got this management portal, and this is, I create my hosted service. So, you know, I call it Joey's service. And then I'm going to type a bunch of stuff. Oh, I can't have that in there. And a URL for the service, right? And it's going to check to make sure it's there. I'm going to choose whatever region or affinity group that I have. I can choose to deploy the application right as I create it, or start it, or don't deploy anything, right? And I click OK, and I create that hosted service. That's one way. There's another way to create hosted services. And that's through this thing called PowerShell. And actually, the reason why I like to use PowerShell to deploy applications is because I like the automation aspect of it, right? There's a lot of times that we're just going to be deploying various versions of these applications over and over and over and over. And I'm a do it once, forget about it kind of guy, right? So I want to script it. So to script it, you've got PowerShell commandlets that are available. Now I've got news, breaking news. I just heard this as I walked into the room today. Breaking news. We have updated the PowerShell commandlets, and we have updated the MMC console, which I'm going to show you in just a moment, today. And they're open source and they're available in Codeplex. You just got to download them, right? Now, anybody in here scared of PowerShell? Ooh, it's hard, right? I like to write batch files. I'm old school. I still have batch files that I wrote like 12 years ago I still run. But I'm slowly learning this PowerShell thing, and it's really not that hard. So to show you kind of a simple deployment that I have in PowerShell, or method of deployment, first thing I'm going to do is I just have to add the snap-in, the PowerShell snap-in, into my PowerShell. And then I mentioned certificates, self-signed certificates that I have that allow me to do remote management. I have previously gone into my Windows Azure account and uploaded a certificate. And what I'm going to do is I've done probably the most extreme scripting you're going to ever see Joey do in PowerShell, which is create variables. Right? That's as close to code as I ever get. So I've got two variables here, one for my subscription ID because I don't want to type that thing again and again and again, and the other one pointing to my certificate. And so what I can actually do is actually show you here. I'm going to go ahead and execute this, but I'll show you here. I'm simply asking for a list of the services that are running in my subscription. So I do get hosted service, followed by the subscription ID, and tell it where the certificate is, and it goes and gets it. Right? I can do that for even individual services, like what's running in my staging or production environment. When I want to do a deployment, I'm still using PowerShell, and I'm adding two additional variables. I mentioned there's two files you deploy out to Windows Azure, the package file and the configuration file. So what I've done is I've created two variables pointing to where they're located. And I just simply say, if you look at the bottom line there, new deployment. I'm going to deploy this to the staging slot of my account, because I mentioned I have production and staging, right? Package, I point to the package file, the variable that I've used. My configuration, I point it to the config file. I give it a label, right? And I tell it where the storage service is that I want it to point to. That's another method of deploying out to Windows Azure. Let's do it. Let's actually deploy this application here. And then I'm also going to do this wait to complete operation here. So let's run that. Go ahead and get it started. The third way of doing deployments is also with the tool System Center Concero. So just like I did in the keynote demo today, with my VMM application, I went in and I chose a new deployment from that private cloud. If I chose my public cloud and chose new deployment, it would pop up with that very same cool graphical window that I showed. And I simply go in and I point to where my configuration file is. And the minute I do that, I get that same pretty graphical view of all of my roles and all of the instances that I have configured in there. And if I have to do any additional configuration, I can do that, and I can do that deployment. So there's a number of different ways we can do deployments. You can use the web page. I like PowerShell. That's me personally. I like to do it over and over again, though Concero is really making a good case for me because I really love the fact that we can look at applications as a whole piece and not worry about all these individual things that we had to previously deal with. So another concept that I want to talk about, I mentioned we have those two environments, staging and production. We have the ability to do what's called a VIP swap. And what this essentially is doing is it allows me to put a version of the application up into the staging slot while there's one running in production. What's the difference between the two? Well, the one that's running in production has really cool URL or common URL like jsnow's application.cloudapp.net. And what's running in your staging environment has a really big, long, ugly GUID.cloudapp.net. And it's great because you can actually put an app up into that staging slot, and you can hand that GUID URL out to your people to test. So you can even do more testing after you've got it deployed up there. Then when you're ready to shift from your testing environment up into production, there's this thing called VIP swap. And if I go out to my Windows Azure portal, and as you can see here, folks, this application deployment has succeeded, this new application. So let me clear out these windows. And you can go, we'll go up here and see that I need to refresh my portal. It's refreshing. Eventually it'll pop up here. But there's this button here called Swap VIP. I've currently got it grayed out because, oh, there you go. There you see the new PowerShell deployment just popped in. Right, you see it's currently stopped, right? I can go ahead and start that. Let me go ahead and start it and get it actually running. But once that gets started and up and running, I can click this Swap VIP button. So what's going to happen then is simple. We're going to go and change the URLs that are pointing to each one of them. So the nice fancy Joey's app.cloudapp.net changes with the GUID. And what's cool about this is that it allows that old production environment to still be running. Because remember, no matter how much user acceptance testing, there's always some situation that we find a bug. And of course, it's critical, and it's going to cause a system-wide outage, or we can't run our particular application. So we very quickly need to roll back. If I go back in and press the VIP swap button again, it swaps it right back over again. Kind of cool, right? Failover really quick. It's the concept of VIP swap. Now, when you're doing a VIP swap between, say, version 1 of an application and version 1.1 or 1.2, it's going to upgrade the entire service. So remember all that stuff I talked about being stateful and running in there? It's going to be gone, right? It turns that staging environment into production, production into staging, any existing state gets lost. So you want to make sure that your users are disconnected, and if you've got any processes running, that those processes are completed, just like what we would do in today's environment. All right? There's another method of doing a deployment is if you have minimal changes. And it's called a rolling upgrade, where we don't have to upgrade the entire thing. We're just upgrading portions of an application and not the whole service. And the idea behind this is that we can use those upgrade domains to upgrade a particular role so that that service remains online and available, right? And you can still have stateful things running in the backside. You don't have to close all of your data connections, make sure no clients are connected, all of that stuff. So what happens is each of those individual roles just kind of roll through. So role 1 gets upgraded, then role 2 gets upgraded, and so on and so on and so on. Okay? Another method of upgrade. So what does that look like from our deployment standpoint? It's the exact same process that we ran the first time. Developer creates this stuff, hands it to you. You create a new storage account or whatever you need necessary. Probably use the same hosted service account. You deploy that up, create any database application, upload your certificates, do any Windows Azure connected settings that you need to do, or maybe remote desktop, do your diagnostics configuration, right? Choose the upgrade type, and there you go. You're off and running. So let's go back here to my demo environment. So you'll see here, I have this new application that I've just deployed, this PowerShell deployment. It's initializing, it's going to come up. And when I'm ready to swap that with what's running in my staging environment, I click that VIP swap button, it's going to switch on over. If I wanted to start those services without using this management portal, I can actually do that within Windows PowerShell. And again, it's pretty simple. Command that I'm going to scroll up here. Right? And I can say get status and change the status to suspended to stop it, or change it to running to run. Now, here's something you need to be aware of in Windows Azure. The minute you click that button to deploy the application is the minute you start getting charged for that piece, because we're dedicating resources to you at that point. So that's when those bills start coming in, right? Now, it's kind of funny because when I start talking about the fact that people pay for usage and they pay for storage and they pay for data network transfers, people just go, oh, wow, I didn't think that's going to be expensive. That's got to be crazy. You're paying for it today on your own on-premise stuff. In fact, in some situations, you may be paying more dependent upon the tax laws of a particular place and the hit that you're taking on the depreciation of your assets. You're paying to cool the thing. You're paying to power the thing, right? You're paying to upgrade those routers and switches and hubs, and you're paying to upgrade the hardware and all of those things. So just keep that in the back of your mind, right? You're just changing how you pay for it. Instead of me going through once every 10 years and replacing my servers, I'm just going out and paying for what I'm using. And that's what's awesome about it. I only pay for what I use. Okay? Now, of course, that brings up the question of how much am I using, right? And that is, again, the role of what you need to do. Figure out, when you start thinking about applications that are right for cloud environments, that's one of the first things you got to start thinking about. Is this an application that I can really afford to have up there because I'm transferring 400 gigabytes of data every hour? Does it make sense for you? I don't know. I can't answer that question for you, right? That's all dependent upon you and your infrastructure. I also mentioned that we had this management portal, or this MMC console. Now, this is a community project, okay? We've just updated the version of the MMC today. I actually didn't even know they were doing it. How cool is that? So I'm running the older version, right? But it just like any MMC console, gives me access to my application, and I can do new deployments, and I can start and I can stop applications, and I can get a view of my staging and production environments, right? All through this, hey, it looks just like an MMC console that I'm used to using. Makes me feel comfortable, makes me feel happy as an IT guy, right? So it's another tool in the toolbox that you have. We're used to using PowerShell, right? Yeah, some of us. We're used to using web portals. Yeah, a lot of us. We're used to using MMC consoles. Okay, cool. It's the same type of tooling that we have. But this kind of brings up the next topic. Once we get applications up there, we have to start dealing with managing those applications. And when we start looking at applications, and where we put applications, and when we decide to run them in the cloud, we have to take things into account like performance. Things like the further away you get from a particular application, the poorer the performance, right? Well, we introduced a new feature in Windows Azure at the latest Mix conference, and it's currently in beta and available. If you have a subscription, you can click the little beta button and access it, which is called Traffic Manager. And what Traffic Manager allows us to do is it allows us to load balance across multiple hosted services. So I can run Joey's application in multiple data centers around the world, right? This allows me to do things related on performance, ensure that users that are closest to the service are getting the closest connection to the closest data center. It allows me to provide fault tolerance. So if for some reason California decides to fall into the Pacific Ocean, I also have data centers running in other places, right? So I can redirect to another deployment that's based on its availability, and it also gives us the ability to do round-robin traffic, right? So this is a brand new feature that's available in Windows Azure in beta form today that you can take advantage of. This is a way to manage traffic within your applications. When we start talking about monitoring Windows Azure, this is where things get a little bit tricky, and I want to introduce this concept of monitoring to you. Let's start here, and I stole this slide. Blatantly stole it from the guy sitting right over there. Inside of Windows Azure, it's essentially a virtual machine, and inside that virtual machine, you have the guest operating system, and inside of that guest operating system, you've got some storage, some local storage. And we can configure that local storage so that we can put things like performance logs and event logs and any counters that we need, right? Application logs, IIS manager logs. But if Windows Azure runs kind of stateless, what happens if that virtual machine that's running your application resets? Where do all those logs go? Poof. What do I have to do so they don't go poof? I have to move them somewhere that I can gain access to. So we move it into cloud storage, right? Once it's moved into cloud storage, then third-party tools, right, like my MMC console or System Center can actually access it. So what we have to do is we have to do two things in diagnostics. By default, things like collecting event logs and performance counters and all sorts of this data is not defaultly captured and moved to storage. We don't do that. You have to configure that. There's two ways to configure it. I'll get to you here in just a moment. There's another way to monitor. See, the bad part of using that first one is like if you use the Azure MMC console to configure and view the data, I can go look at event log data or performance log information, but it comes down in like these evil Excel files. as text. I don't get the pretty performance monitor, right? I don't get the great, awesome event viewer that I'm so used to looking at. There's another way to go get that information. That's to connect directly to the role itself via RDP. And you can actually configure RDP access for any of your running instances running in Windows Azure. So if I go to my portal and you take a look at my application that I've currently got running in my management portal, you'll see that this particular instance I've actually enabled RDP access to. So I can simply connect, and what it's going to do is it's going to ask me for my password, which I've already pre-configured, which you do in your setup environment. Now, the developer has to enable it within the application first, and then there's a little switch that you configure on your side that says whether or not it's active or not, what the username is, and what the password is. And then once I get that application out there, and I've already actually got one running, I'm actually looking inside, it looks a lot like Windows Server. And I have a performance monitor. And I have pretty graphs flowing, and I have real-time access to my event log data. The other cool thing that you can do is you can use a set of PowerShell commands to actually take a Windows Azure instance out of the load balancer and troubleshoot it. So you can tell it to set busy, it takes it out of the load balancer, I'm still connected, it's still running, I haven't stopped it, haven't deleted it, and I can get my developer on the phone and we can connect in via remote desktop and fix whatever might be happening in that application or whatever might be happening in that particular instance. I love this because this is how I manage my servers. It's how I manage my servers today. I sit in my nice little cozy office with my remote management tools and I RDP into the server. I make any changes that I need to do. I go look at the event log data and then I move on. Right? So even monitoring is not all that different, specifically when you've got the MMC console. I'm sorry, when you've got RDP access. And then that final way is through System Center, but System Center eventually will have an agent. Currently it does not. Currently it requires this scenario, where I'm taking the data, I'm transferring it onto cloud storage, System Center grabs it and then looks at it. Now, monitoring. I mentioned there's some configuration that you actually have to do. Here's how it works. Developer kind of you can do it one of two ways. When your role starts, and your role starts up, and you've configured Windows Azure Diagnostics, there's two ways to configure it. At start time, or remotely at any time. Start time is when your developer does it. I don't recommend this, because once it's configured, you can't change it, right? Without going up and redeploying the application again, right? I like to do it remotely at any time, and I can do that through the Windows Azure MMC. Once you get that, you actually create little pieces, little buckets of that storage that says, okay, I'm going to carve up 4 gig for my event logs, I'm going to carve up 3 gig for my perfmon logs, 2 meg for my IIS logs, right? I'm going to carve it up. And then what we do is we take all that information and we put it into that local storage, and then we have to go get that information out, as I mentioned. And you can choose to pull that information on demand or a scheduled resource. And just to show you how quick and easy it is to really configure, it's really simple through our MMC console. This is where I go in and configure my diagnostics. So I can choose whatever log files I want to get, any event logs. So like here, I want to go ahead and give this a 14 meg buffer. And anytime there's an error, let me move this out, and I can let's choose system events. Right? And then let's also choose application events. And then I can also do the same with my performance counters. And you see I've already chosen a couple of different performance counters that I have here. And then once I click Save Instrumentation, it's going to go through to to this particular instance. It's running in production, so I'm only going to affect my production instance. And it's going to update all of those different information. And then eventually, that system's going to collect that information and start shipping it out where I can go out and grab it. So that's the tricky part about diagnostics when you're doing anything other than remoting into it. You need to configure it so it transfers. And then you can set the transfer through the MMC console to start doing it automatically, so it's just dumping the stuff out into cloud storage. Make sense? Then we can use our tools that we're used to using to get the information, right? You can choose a time range for transferring data. You can filter it based on event logs, if it's a warning, if it's just an exclamation point, hey, this thing happened here, right? And as I mentioned before, you can configure it at start time. That's good because it's automatically configured when a role starts up and nobody has to do anything, but it's bad if you want to keep changing it because you got to redeploy the app. Or you can use the API, and there's third-party tools that do this as well. So the MMC is just one aspect of a third-party tool that allows you to do it. I mentioned the RDP and how we can remotely access our instance. I talked about that set ready and set busy. It takes me out of the load balancer so I can do some troubleshooting. And then there's a System Center Operations Manager management pack that's currently in release candidate, where you can actually go in and discover all your Windows Azure applications, and you can look at them in the System Center format that you're used to. You can collect event logs, you can collect performance and perfmon information, right? Also monitoring a collection of anything running in the .NET framework, trace messaging, anything for your developers. And then we talked about, I've mentioned it kind of throughout, but I wanted to again highlight out System Center code name Concero, which allows us to kind of manage across both our public and private clouds, but it really gives an IT pro a pretty easy graphical view of the application and how it runs. We can connect via RDP using it. We can stop. We can scale out. We can, and it gives us a job history and a library of the activities that we've hit. It's a lot of information. And I'm coming up on my time here, and I want to get to a few of your questions, and I know that a lot of you want to go get beer, and I'm going to follow right behind you. What's your next steps? What are the things you can do to learn more? Now, when you walked in the door, you should have gotten a little card, right, which is a free Windows Azure 30-day pass. No credit card required. Go out and try it. Kick the tires a little bit, right? Maybe go out and install Visual Studio and deploy a simple web application if you want. My application is nothing but the default ASP.NET page that I'm running here, right? Because that's as far as development skills as I get, right? Another place that you can go to get information is the Microsoft Virtual Academy. And it's free information, and it's not just on Windows Azure, but we also are putting information out there on private clouds and how we can create private clouds and dealing with System Center and those things. And we've got additional information coming up, more information on Windows Azure. I kind of cover an overview. We go through the various roles. We go deeper into these topics, so that things that I kind of had to gloss over to get through, you can go in a little bit deeper. Connect with other IT professionals that are just trying to learn and discuss about the cloud. But the cool thing is you get achievements, baby. You're supposed to laugh there. Don't we all want achievements? So you can get achievements as you go through the various steps of the Virtual Academy. To get to that, go to MicrosoftVirtualAcademy.com.